1 square megameter is equivalent to 1,000,000 square kilometers. Nowadays, about 130 square megameters of Earth's land surface, which is 100% of Earth's land surface, is under state control. When states started in Southwest Asia and Egypt around 3000 BC, the total amount of land under their control is estimated to have been about a fifth of 1 square megameter, less than 0.2% of the 130 megameters currently under the authority of state structures. While individual civilizations would rise and fall, altogether across time, the general story is that of more and more land coming under state control. Of the 4 world zones during the era of agrarian civilizations, Afro-Eurasia and the Americas had such civilizations, while Australasia and the Pacific Island world zones did not. This video is going to consider more specifically the broad story of the rise and fall of civilizations in Afro-Eurasia from their advent to the first year of the Common Era. First, let's cover 3000 to 1000 BC. In Mesopotamia, after the founding of the first city of Uruk, many more cities and many kings arose. And some kings conquered other kings and grew the amount of people, area, and resources under their control. In 2334 BC, Sargon came to power, and he soon built what's considered by many to be the first empire. Sargon's empire fell apart by 2150 BC, and around 350 years later, Hammurabi of Babylon re-established order in the region, and the Hittites came soon after in 1595 BC, establishing a major empire which was at its greatest expanse around 1350 BC and collapsed around 1200 BC. The already mildly powerful Assyrians now had space to grow in the vacuum of power left behind and faced near constant rebellion against their rule. In early Egypt, the primary expansion took place towards the south into Nubia, but after more than 500 years after the advent of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, drought set in around 2200 BC, and the authority at the top withered and regional rule reigned. By around 2040, order had been restored, the Middle Kingdom began, and expansion continued, but it fell apart by 1782 BC. Starting to invade from 1650 BC, by 1600, the Hyksos had come in and taken over in the north, and by around 1550, Pharaoh Amosi had ousted them and the new kingdom of Egypt began. Expansion continued with numerous campaigns into Nubia and now as well along the eastern Mediterranean coast, but by 1070 BC, the pharaohs had once again lost control of their empire, and the third intermediate period began. Indus Valley civilization flourished from at least 2500 BC, peaking at controlling some 500,000 square miles. The great cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had been vacated by 1700 BC, and the civilization had collapsed by 1500 BC. Around that time, 1500 BC, militarized nomads fancying themselves Aryans or noble people streamed down from the north and slowly began taking control of the Indus Valley. These nomadic people were led by tribal warlords, but with time they became sedentary and ruled by oft-competing regional kings. In China, the Shang dynasty arose around 1600 BC, ruling far more land than the preceding Xia, and established the first full-scale agrarian civilization of China. With the Shang king's head removed in 1045 BC, the Zhou dynasty began, and their state expanse was far larger than the Shang still. As we reach 1000 BC, the total amount of land under state control is estimated to have multiplied approximately tenfold from 2,000 years prior, to 2% of the total landmass on Earth, a total of 1.6 square megameters. As we round this corner of 1000 BC, the Assyrians are on the edge of rising considerably in Mesopotamia and becoming the major power there. Egypt is in decline. India has Aryans continuing to expand within it, establishing Raja-ruled chiefdoms, and the Zhou rule in China. We now turn to the history of Afro-Eurasian civilizations from 1000 BC to 1 CE. In Mesopotamia, the Assyrians rose to new heights starting around 912 BC, but they had their capital sieged and subsequently burned by the Medes and Chaldeans in 612 BC, and their empire fell with the final defeat of their king 3 years later in 609 BC. Babylon then breathed one last breath of Mesopotamian independent self-rule, with much of Mesopotamia being controlled by non-local civilizations from there on, starting with its absorption into the growing Achaemenid Persian Empire, who we'll meet in a moment, in 539 BC. Egypt entered the new millennia in chaos, with assorted bastions of local control. This vulnerable state had them partially conquered, with dynasties established by the Libyans and the Nubians, and Egypt finally gasped one last breath of self-rule, which ended in 525 when the Persians came knocking. Meanwhile, after 1000 BC, the Aryans of the Indus expanded further, and the river basin of the Ganges saw itself under the rule of numerous city-states run by kings called Maharajas. And then the Persians came and conquered parts of northern India. Then Alexander came and conquered the Persians and numerous Maharajas. And into the vacuum that followed Alexander's departure in 325 BC, Chandragupta Maurya, who started his reign 324 BC, began conquering his neighbors and starting the Mauryan Empire, the first mostly unified state of India, which peaked under Chandragupta's grandson Ashoka, covering almost 2 million square miles. The expansionary tendencies of the empire were halted when Ashoka converted to Buddhism after a war horrified him. The empire had fallen apart by 185 BC. By 800 BC, numerous non-unified city-states had arisen in the growing Greek world. These city-states often differed from each other significantly, culturally, governmentally, and militarily. Expanding on the trade networks developed previously by the Phoenicians and the Minoans, the Greeks traded profusely and expanded through establishing new colonies. But their success was to be tempered by the largest yet civilization coming from the east, the Persians. From tribal confederations to kings, the Persians eventually came under the rule of Cyrus in 558 BC, who vanquished their local rivals, the Medes. Cyrus then expanded the empire rapidly, followed by his son Cambyses and grandson Darius, bringing more than 10% of Earth's land surface under their rule. This old Persian empire, called the Achaemenid Empire, eventually reached its limit militarily after Darius decided some Greek colonies should be his, took them, and failed in subsequent campaigns against the Greeks, who rebelled in 500 BC and got the Athenians involved. Soon after, the Macedonian king Philip took over Greece, and his son Alexander took over Persia by 330 BC, and he then conquered land up to the Indus River. After his death in 323 BC, his empire was split among 4 of his generals. One of them, Seleucus, donated his name to the Seleucid Empire, against whom the Parthians rebelled in 238 BC and built their own state. On the Italian peninsula, a rather normal city ousted its Etruscan king and established a constitution with power in the hands of 2 consuls in 509 BC. And 200 years later, they paid a ransom to occupying Gauls to leave their city, and shortly thereafter, Rome began conquering neighboring lands. By 146 BC, Rome had defeated their last regional rival, Carthage. They expanded further, peaking at having about 2.5 million square miles under their rule, and had turned from republic to empire decades before the advent of the new millennia arrived. In China, as we turn around 1000 BC, the Zhou are in charge. But that had collapsed by the 8th century BC, and then the Warring States era began 480 BC, and the Warring State of the Qin won, and began their rule under legalism by 221 BC and unified much of China, coming to control 1 million square miles, and the following dynasty, the Han Dynasty, started in 206 BC, peaked at 2.5 million square miles, adopted Confucianism as the state philosophy, and were ruling China as the new millennia came. By 1 CE, the estimated amount of land under state control had multiplied 300% over the previous 1,000 years to around 6% of Earth's total landmass, or about 8 square megameters, and we're just getting started.